Hello, good evening, and welcome to the first ever Stageworthy podcast live stream. I've never done anything like this before, so I'm really excited to do this. Thank you for joining me, and especially thank you to Eliza Martin, who is joining me. Eliza, welcome to the first ever Stageworthy live stream.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Now, of course, one of the reason why we're here is because you have a book coming out, and the reason why that's a stage worthy thing is because you adapted your play Harvey and the Extraordinary into this book. So, could you start by telling us a little bit about the play Harvey and the Extraordinary?
Yeah. So Harvey and the Extraordinary was a play that we workshopped in 2017. Myself and my director, Neil Silcox. And then in 2018, we performed it in the Toronto Fringe Festival. And it was a site specific show, immersive site specific. And the character, Mimi, the main character, puts on a mime show for her father. And she kind of invites the neighborhood and the audience to come join her. So we had the audience come and sit in the garage, in a real garage, and we performed the show.
What was the audience reaction like to sitting in a garage? I know what my reaction was like because I saw it, but you've performed it a number of times. So what was that experience like of bringing the audience into Mimi's space?
It was neat. I really loved it. I think that like the way we did the show felt really authentic to the story. So I absolutely adored it. Interestingly enough, I have to say, as an audience member, I don't always love when I'm in a very small space with a performer. I think I feel kind of put on the spot, but we worked really hard to make it really like friendly and inviting. And the beautiful thing about having Mimi, a young girl as the
Hmm.
main character, is I think it kind of empowers the audience, who are usually a group of adults, um, to feel comfortable. Whereas sometimes when you're in an immersive or site specific, space, you don't always feel, I don't know, in control, I guess I would say. And I think sometimes people don't love that feeling. So I think knowing that the character is younger than you, we sort of felt like it was a space where the audience members almost wanted to take care of her a bit. And so they were really wanting and willing to participate, which was such a nice dynamic. And I think a lot nicer in some ways than people feeling as if they were going to be sort of picked on, or they're going to have to, be pulled up and put on the spot.
There is certainly that experience of like going through the Fringe program and it says audience participation or something like that, and you're like, oh man, you kind of want to see the show, but audience participation, really? And you sort of
Yeah.
you go into it and you don't know. There are only a couple of experiences that I've been at where the audience was like into any kind of connection or audience experience. Your show was one of them. Another one was Snafu Dance's Little Orange Man, which by the end of the show had the audience clamoring to participate. So it's super rare and super difficult to do. So you certainly, I remember doing that and like being in that garage. And you're right, the audience did really want to take care of Mimi and was rooting for her. And I think it was a unique experience in that way that made it so that we wanted to participate in a way that we wouldn't have, I think, if even if it was in a traditional theater space. I think the setting helped with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely felt that performing it, and I loved the feeling of, like there was this sort of moment at the beginning of the show where Mimi the character is who, seats everyone. So she puts
Yeah.
on a little sign, and I love that says, usher, and she brings everyone in and she puts them around, and she sort of decorates the space almost. She pulls out, these stuffed animals, and I think that felt very, yeah, it just felt very authentic at the time, and
Hmm.
and it was really fun to do as an actor.
Was there any for you as the actor of the show? Was there any trepidation about, um, you know, like looking because sometimes, especially with the solo show, you kind of have this like, do I want to see my audience before the show? Do I want to know who's out there? Did you have any of that, or was it like you have to commit to this because that's what Mimi would do?
I mean, I definitely yeah, I definitely was sort of nervous about that. I actually don't always love doing that either. I don't really love I don't always love having to be in character as the audience comes in or to be like
Mhm.
present on stage. I've also done that. And that can be challenging as well. And I think it's just there's just I think an added challenge as an actor. You don't get
Yeah.
that sort of in the wing time. There's no wings,
No.
obviously. Um to sort of take a moment. And I was lucky because I did get that time because the virtue of being at the fringe is you have the sort of fringe spiel that happens at the beginning.
Yes, yes.
And yeah, that was a moment where I would actually go and stand out in the alleyway and I would kind of collect myself a bit. And then I
Mm,
would make, an entrance again, so to
yeah.
speak. So that was helpful for me. But I really did enjoy it. In a lot of ways, this was just a show that was very different than other shows that I've written and performed, but also other shows that I've just been a part of in how I felt about it and the way we kind of handled those moments. It was sort of it was an exception for me.
Can you tell me about what was different, especially about the writing of the show? What was different about the writing of Mimi and the Extraordinary as a play, as opposed to some of the other things that you've done?
It definitely came together. Excuse me, came together quite quickly, which was a really big gift at the time that it was
Mm.
happening. I think when I started to write it, I was in the midst of doing several versions of my previous solo show, Oh, and I felt sort of stuck at a certain point. I kind of felt like I had lived with this previous show for so long and it had gone through so many different versions. And I knew I needed to do the next version. And I don't know, Harvey felt like this really nice breath of fresh air for me. And the
Mm,
idea kind of came to me very suddenly and it came to me fully formed in a way that when I wrote this sort of first draft idea, I wrote it in a night and I emailed Neil Silcox in the morning and said, "Hey, I think I have something. Do you want to work on it with me?" I think, he just felt like the perfect person to work with on this. So the actual writing process felt there was just so much ease around it.
mm,
And it's not always like that for me. So that was a really beautiful gift. And then everything else was very much teased out with Neil's help.
mhm,
A lot of the character work inspired a lot of the monologues that came through. And in the Fringe version, I actually played four of the characters.
mhm,
Where in the previous workshop version, I was just Mimi, and there no other characters appeared on
mm.
stage. So that was really kind of gifted to me working with Neil because he was the outside eye and the guidance I needed to develop the other characters.
Mhm. Um, you said, you wrote it very quickly. As far as, like, how far in advance of knowing that you were gonna do it in Fringe did you do it? Because you had the workshop, and when after that workshop did you decide that you were gonna do it as a site specific for Fringe?
I think we actually decided, it's hard for me to remember now. I think we decided at the workshop because
Mm.
the workshop was the same space. We were really
Oh.
fortunate. Yeah, and we had these lovely friends, Jeff and Sarah, who offered the garage, and we workshopped it there. And I think we had such a wonderful time. They really enjoyed having it, and they were so game for everything that it
Mm.
kind of brought. And so we had a conversation, I believe, around that time. And they sort of said, "Listen, if you are interested in using the space again, like it's yours." And so we knew pretty early. Yeah.
That's pretty gracious of these people to say, "Yes, please invite strangers into our garage that's in our
Yes.
backyard in this alley and, in among our space." So, very good of
Yeah.
them to give you that.
Absolutely. And they just let like I would get ready in their home.
Wow.
Now that I say it, so generous. I would get ready in their home every night. Like they such kind people to be like, let's just let this bizarre woman come into our home, go into our bathroom and put on full mime makeup and then come into our garage and perform for a bunch of strangers and usually, friends as well, obviously.
Mm,
But
yeah.
yeah, really, really, really gracious of them.
Now, Mimi as a character, you've mentioned that she's putting on a mime show, but she doesn't really get, like, in the play, she doesn't really get to the mime show because she's waiting for her dad to show before she starts the mime show, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, you're sort of setting up that there's a mime show, but then not doing the mime show, which is sort of like a great little switch on the audience, that you've told them it's a mime show, but then you don't do it. Was there ever any, like, as people have very strong feelings about mime and mimes. Was there ever, like, did you always know that she was going to be thinking it was going to be a mime show, but she wasn't going to mime?
I did. I think originally I thought there might be a little bit more mime. But I was never intending for it to be very good mime, which was nice because I sort of cut those corners with the fact that she is a child.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I got lucky in that way. But yes, I was really interested in this idea of waiting and the discomfort that comes with waiting. And
Mm.
I really wanted the audience to be waiting in real time with her.
Mhm.
And I just wanted the tension of that. So that was always something that I was very aware of. But interestingly enough, I feel as though in the play, the audience catches on pretty quickly, or that's sort of the sense I got from
Mm.
being in the room. And yet I find in the book, because this is very much written, of course, it's for young people. Um, there isn't that same tension. I don't think you catch on as quickly or as easily as what will happen for Mimi. There's certainly a few bends in the road, whereas my audience actually was mostly adults. Even though it was
Yeah.
family friendly, I didn't really have a lot of young people come. And I usually felt in the room like there was this like feeling of anticipation, and that I think most adults guessed what was going to happen and the way it was going to go.
Right. Now, when you say that they guess what was gonna happen, like, they figured it out, can you say a little bit more about, because they figured out, whether her dad was going to show up or not? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's often how I felt. I usually felt I'm trying to think, how am I giving any spoilers? I usually felt in the moment in the show that the adults assumed that this was going to be in some way a bad situation. I don't think anyone guessed the ending, so to
No.
speak. But I even remember one night as I like was in, I think, one of the opening monologues. Someone was like, "Oh,"
No.
and it was like a moment where I sort of said, like, I'm waiting for my dad, and like I know he's gonna come, and I can't wait for this. And someone like audibly groaned, like they completely were aware that they were gonna be sitting for an hour with
I
this very little girl. Like,
hmm. I think there's a thing about the fact that, when you're in a theater, you're sort of like looking at the conventions of, okay, so we're in this theater, there's this one performer, and she says this, the adult brain will sort of jump through to conclusions, right? And get to the, oh, I think this. You don't have that in a book. You
hmm,
don't have that,
hmm,
it's not obvious in that way in a book. So let's talk
absolutely.
about the book. And can you tell me a little bit about the process of turning this play? First off, when did the idea of turning it into a book begin? What was the genesis of making Harvey and the Extraordinary into a book? How did that happen?
We had my editor, who turned out to be my editor, Claire Caldwell, attend the show one night. However, interestingly enough, I had no idea who she was. We had never met before. And she had just picked a show out of the program, was my
Hmm.
understanding. Um, and so she, little did I know, was in the audience one night. Previous to this, I was always interested in writing for children, and I was actually working on a manuscript for a picture book, but a totally different story. And the same night that this happened, I'm very interested in this idea because I think it's so bizarre. I was telling Neil as we were setting up, I was saying, I think after this show closes, I'm going to take a bit of a break from acting, and I'm just going to focus on writing. I would really like to finish this
Hmm.
manuscript. And we were just chatting as we were setting up. And that night, Claire was actually in the audience. And I briefly met her after. And she sent me an email, and the
Mm.
next day it just sort of said, like, would you like to get together and talk about this?
Mm.
And a few meetings later, I really felt that what I wanted to pitch, because our discussion was just about writing for children. And I really felt like I wasn't done with this story. And the show closed at the Fringe, and I was like, I still really feel present to this world, and I would like to pitch this as a book. And I played for a second with, is it a picture book, or
Mm.
is it something older? And interestingly enough, Mimi, as she was in the play, was an 8-year-old, and 8 kind of falls between two readership categories.
Mm.
So often they want the character to be on the older end of a category, and readers are usually slightly younger than the character whose
Mm.
story they're reading. And so we had a discussion of, is this an early chapter book, or is this, it ended up being a middle grade chapter
Mm.
book. And that's roughly ages 8 to 12, 9 to 12. So that's what it ended up being. But we had sort of this, a really interesting discussion about which way it should kind of tip and fall. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was a really big shift, because as I said, the audience was a lot of adults.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like an interesting thing to kind of negotiate and navigate. So that was the beginning of how it came to be. But Harvey specifically was never really in my mind before this meeting as the book. It was a totally different book in my dream world. And then it became Harvey.
Now, you mentioned, you just also alluded to the fact that you wanted to write a children's book. What was the draw to a children's book? What was it that drew you to wanting to create that?
I've always loved children's lit. I just have absolutely been obsessed with it. And I think it was certainly the fact that I was a huge reader growing up. Like, I was quite the bookworm. And I really, really I actually loved middle grade as sort of a category of book. Was always a favorite of mine. And so I think those books that I loved so much really never left me. So I had this huge appreciation for children's lit. And then I had worked with children for a long time. So these were sort of the stories and the things I was surrounded by day after day. So when I would be working in a classroom, or I was working in a preschool, I would be reading children's book to children's, and to children, I'd be able to understand how it would land and what would really captivate them. And I think that certainly solidified it. But I would say definitely it was the fact that I was such a big reader growing up, and those kind of it just never left me.
There are books when you read as a kid that sort of stick with you, right? Like, there are a number of books that I read when I was a kid. I can still remember so many of the beats of those stories. Or sometimes there's like the strangest flash of, like, there was this book that was like British book, and it was this, I think it was like five do a thing. It was like the five children book, and they called each other like weird nicknames, like squirrel and things like that. And I was like, man, never had a cool nickname like that. But it was like all of these, like, that's something that comes back to me now and then. I'm like, that's a weird thing, but these are stories that I read when I was quite young, and so they were still buried in there, but they are the things that made me a reader later on, right? So these are very important books for children to
Yes.
read.
Yeah, I think those books, they don't really leave you. Like, I think those are really fundamental experiences for young people, and they become part of your identity. Like, I really think that they just provide you with so many lessons, and you learn so much from them, and you relate so much to them. Like, I think it's really quite profound.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is. Now, of course, taking something that was made for the stage and transforming it into a book, especially a book for children, you can't just like take the text and like slap it into a book and, wipe your hands on your pants, say you're done. There are things that have to change. So what was the process of transforming this play into a book? What was that like? What kind of changes did you have to make? And was it as easy to write the book as it was to write the play?
It was not as easy to write the book as it was to write the play. I'm sorry to say. I did, I did try in some ways to kind of quite literally like lift sections of the play, because
Mm.
the beauty, as I'm sure you experience as well, Phil, like the beauty of a solo show is because these monologues are so, they're the character's voice. At first, I kind of thought, okay, I wonder how many of these
Mhm.
monologues can just be put into the book. So
Mhm.
I think probably my very first draft I did was a lot of the play. Like it
Mm.
really was. And it's very much changed since then. I think for there's maybe one kind of monologue that is sort of stuck through, and everything else is quite transformed. Um, and the process was really funny for that reason. I think one of the biggest things I had to navigate was sort of narration,
Mm.
because it is first person, like it is Mimi's perspective, which is great. However, I'm so used to when I write a show being able to just write in the character's voice. And then I
Mhm.
think, well, because it's my show, I'm like, oh, I'll fill in that patch there with some stage action. Or I will, write a stage direction. And
Mm.
obviously, there's no stage directions and there's no actions that occur
Mm.
without being written into the book. And
Mhm.
that may sound very like simple, but for me, that was the most confusing part of writing the book
Mm.
was, you can't sort of say like, she picks up the mug, walks across the room and sits on the bench. Because everything is in the character's voice. And suddenly I'm writing what might have been a stage direction
Right.
as narration in the book in the character's voice. So how would she describe picking up this mug, and how would she describe walking across the room and sitting on the bench? And what does the bench look like? And that for me was discombobulating.
That is very mind bendy.
It really was. And I remember I talked to Claire, the my editor, about it, and I was sort of saying, I'm just so used to stage directions, or even what can be communicated with something like a lighting change or
Mm.
something like a sound cue. You can't communicate in any other way but
Mhm.
what is written on the page. And of course, like, it's supported by beautiful illustrations by Anna Braun, but everything is told through the story, and that for me was a really big shift from theater.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's there's like little things like that where like for theater we don't think about that so much. Like you're like I can just present this, but having distinct voice is that's like what makes the book about the character. Donna
Mhm.
has a question that she was asking about, and that is, were there any guidelines related to vocabulary and sentence structure for this age group?
That is a great question. There weren't, they weren't made explicit to me, but definitely, and Donna is a teacher, so she knows. um, but definitely, it was something that I had to really think about and research. And there is this sort of funny negotiation because Mimi is a very precocious character, and I thought, well, I want to use some big words that she might use, but for her, these words would be italicized because
Right.
she's using them in such a way to be a little bit showy.
Hmm.
But I'm also thinking, are these words that are actually appropriate for the reader? Are these words that I don't want to have them every 2 seconds put down a book and pull out a dictionary? I want them to be challenged just enough, but I want it to keep flowing. So it was something I was thinking about a lot, but this wasn't imposed on me
Mm.
by, say, Anik Press. It was just something that we kept in mind. And then during the editing process, occasionally we would flag things and talk about them and say, is there a more age appropriate way of saying this? Or
Mhm.
would the readers get this? That sort of conversation.
Is there were there in terms of those big words, because kids will latch on to a big word when they know it. Like if they think they understand what it means, they'll sort of latch onto it and they'll use it in a way to makes them sound older and smarter and all of these things. How did you, I mean, you had discussions, but were there like how did you decide what the words were that would be right for the age that would they might know, but again, like you were saying, that they wouldn't have to pick up a dictionary every few minutes. Like, how did you
Mhm.
decide what those words are? Because again, your audience for the play, you could do that, and they were adults understanding that this child may have heard this word and, feels very proud about using it. Whereas the readers of the book may not be in that situation. So how did you choose those big words?
That's a great question. I think I was sort of given a bit of a shortcut because, again, I do work with kids, and so I had my subjects, so to speak, every day interacting with me, and I was able to sort of suss things out just from spending time with them and interacting
Mm,
with them, um, and that was a great help for me. I think I definitely had the young people I work with in mind when I was writing.
mm,
So a little bit of guessing, a little bit of googling, and mostly working with young people and just being really used to the ways that they speak and what might be an kind of you know, an attainable challenge, so to speak, an attainable goal.
Now you were on, I mean, you were on Stageworthy around the time that Harvey and the Extraordinary was being produced for Fringe, and we talked about
Mhm.
about you as a childhood educator, and that, like you've just mentioned, like working with children in that way. What what draws you continually back to being an educator for children? What is it that calls you to that, in addition to being a theater artist? What's the draw to childhood and children and the education?
I mean, I just think that they're the most incredible people. I think children are wonderful, and yes, previous to this, I was working in the world of early childhood education and arts education, and then I just went back to school and did my master's in child and youth care, and now I fall sort of more on the mental health side, which is really interesting as well. But I'm so drawn to children's sense of play and their
Mm,
creativity, and I think that there's just something so incredible about the fact that, just like the rest of us, they have these wonderful, lively imaginations. And yet, and in some ways, they don't yet have the kind of judgment and societal
mm,
expectations that adults live with on the day to day. And certainly, there are incredible pressures of being a young person. I don't envy them, especially teens. But it's just a really different experience living as a young person and living as an adult. And I so want to preserve that for them
mm.
and to help and to advocate for them and to encourage them to advocate themselves. I just think that they are absolutely incredible, strong, brilliant people, um and they're hilarious and wonderful and charming, and I'm all for it.
There's something about that sense of play, though. As theater artists, we talk a lot about play and, getting into space. I want to play, and we need to connect with our sense of play a lot of the times. But there's also the aspect that sense of play that children have, and that sense of imagination gets sort of like wrung out of us as we get older, and we sort of have to try to find our way back to it. Have you found that your work with children has allowed you to more easily drop into a sense of play as a theater artist?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think just as I was sort of saying before, like I'm so present to their voices and to their likes and dislikes and their preferences, and that really helps me. But yes,
Hmm.
it keeps me very creative and very playful, um and they're so free in a way that I
Yeah.
think, if I were to work in a workplace that is all adults, well, what would I do with my silly hats? I don't know. Where would I be able to wear them? And there's just, certain things that I think we kind of don't allow in
Hmm.
adulthood. And I think it's a shame. I think that we really should work hard to, I mean, it shouldn't be work, but at this point, we should work hard to kind of connect to our inner children and our sense of play. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's definitely not always welcome in certain spaces. So
No, I definitely agree, because I always feel like there's this sense where you reach a certain age and you're not supposed to like certain things anymore.
no.
Like, oh, you're too old for like for me when I was a kid and even into my teenage years, I was really into comic books. And then it was a certain point where it was like, well, you shouldn't be into comic books anymore. You're too old for that. And so you give them up and you take your collection and you sell it off or whatever it is because you think I'm an adult now. I'm not supposed to like childish things. And yet I also think that we're sort of living in a time when it's now a little bit more okay to hold on to some of those childish things, but again, we're still like playing at being adults, so we don't play as much. There's this fine line between like I can like comic books because they make movies out of them now, but I'm not a person. I shouldn't be playing in the same way. I lose my sense of play. It's one of those things that sometimes I feel like we should all just go out as adults and play tag or something just to reconnect and just find that sense of play again.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I took a course this year about children in play, and actually our professor, his assignment to us was this idea of non-purposive play. So I think as adults, we're very into, we play in certain ways, like you go to the gym and you work out, that could be
Mhm.
perceived as play, or you teach yourself to play guitar, right? But often there's a really specific goal in mind, and it tends to be about skill building and mastery and about
Mhm.
the destination and not the kind of process. And I was just speaking to a friend about this today. And I think what's so amazing about children in play or just artists in play is it is so about the process.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily master anything ever. You could just play and keep playing, and that's it. That's exactly the space that you're supposed to be in. And
Yeah.
we have something to learn for sure
Yeah.
from young people
Yeah. I'm gonna take
in
a
many
second just to
ways.
remind everybody who's like watching live, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll address those like we did for Donna. But in terms of that sense of play, did you find as you were creating this book, did you find your own sense of play while you were writing?
Yes, I would say I did. I had to work harder to find play in the editing process than I did in the writing process. Um, but I would say that I definitely did. I think because it was my first book, that was sort of a gift in itself because I wasn't yet sure how exactly I wanted to work on it. It was just such a lengthier process than writing a play, or certainly writing solo shows, which is what I was writing before, which are often only about an hour for me.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think I had to learn how to be playful in it. And because I didn't exactly know what I was, it didn't feel I knew what I was doing in a lot of the steps. I was quite playful. I would try different things, and I was trying different ways of working and different times of working. And I think I found my way, but I really think that being new to it was a gift because it made me playful.
Sure, because there's if especially if you haven't like if it's definitely your first time and you haven't had, you haven't done a course or anything like that, you don't know what the rules are. So you have this
Mm,
freedom to be like, if the only way I'm going to figure this out is by messing around. So there you go. Did
yeah.
did you have did your editor guide you through the process? Like when you started putting the book together, did you have somebody sit you down and say, "Here's what the process of writing a book and taking a book to publishing looks like," or did you have to figure that out on your own?
No, I definitely had a lot of guidance from Anik Press, which was really wonderful. And when we were Phil, when you and I were briefly talking about the power of deadlines, one of the first things we did is when I was working with Claire Caldwell, is we set out our deadlines. We sort of
Mhm.
said, okay, well, it's quite funny because she said to me, well, what do you think for like a first draft? When do you think you'd have it done? And I was like, I have absolutely no idea. When do you think I should have it done? I just didn't yet have a sense of how long it would take me, but we picked our whole process, our deadlines for the whole process, and
Mm,
then we just sort of touched back in around them. And I think we really did pick well. I think they
yeah.
really, it wasn't incredibly rushed, but at the same time, this was the early days of the pandemic. So this is really all I was doing. I was doing a little bit of online teaching of creative workshop stuff, but mostly I was writing. And they had the deadlines, but experiencing it was really different than than how I understood it at the beginning. Kind of
Mm.
like living it was really interesting compared to what I thought it would be, and what parts move slow, what parts move quickly, and what surprised me. Um, it was different than I imagined, and I really adored it, but it was really interesting being new to it.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned we were talking about deadlines before we started this and how, like, for example, when I was writing my solo play, The Commandment, I worked on that for 8 years before I finally said, if I do not set a performance date for this, I will never finish writing this. And how motivating that can be. And also, you hit a point where you're like, it's got to be good enough. I cannot be perfect, which if you have a perfectionist attitude, if you're like a perfectionist at heart, it's hard to do any of these things because you're going to have to release it and be like, it's the deadline, so this is what they get. You sort of
Mhm.
have to just put that out there, which can be frightening. But again, if you don't have that, you'll just do it forever.
I agree. That's absolutely how I feel. And I definitely suffer from the perfectionist
Well, that
attitude,
must have
but
been that must have been very difficult for you to get to approach those deadlines and be like, well, do I miss the deadline or do I submit it as it is, even though I'm not 100% happy with it?
yeah, absolutely. It was tough. It really did it genuinely helped me that I was new to the process because I
Hmm.
had nothing to compare it to. So I had no sense, as I was handing in, say, my first draft, which now I look back on and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was wildly different than the final manuscript. But as I handed it in, I had no sense of. It also really helped me that we did talk about word count, and I knew roughly what I should be hitting in
Hmm.
terms of the type of book it is. So that really helped. But even still, looking back, I think it would feel very different to then write another book and to go, okay, well, this first draft, was quite different compared to the last first draft
Hmm.
in how far along it is or how developed it is in certain ways. But it was kind of a gift that I didn't
Yeah.
really know, because I think looking back, I would have judged myself quite harshly.
It's funny because
But
sometimes there are writers that I look to, like there are writers who write some really great books and have great things to say about writing. And the author Neil Gaiman has often said, you don't know how to write a novel. You only learn how to write the novel that you're working on right now, which
right.
is like sort of like very freeing to be like, okay, I will never actually know how to write a book. I'll only ever be able to figure out how to write this book. And then the next book is another discovery.
Yes. And I imagine that, like, we would like to think that the next thing will be easier. I always would like to think that, and I
I would
always
like to
say
think that
that.
too. I would like to think that too.
But I actually think that, I don't know if you experience this, but every time I go to write or just create something new, I always have this sense of, I don't know how to do it. I've never done it before, which I
Yes.
know to be untrue. And I know that I will do it and it will happen. And then I'll go, oh wow, I did it. Great. And then the next thing will happen, and it's like I've hit my head and I've forgotten that I ever did the previous thing.
Right.
But yeah, somehow every process tricks you into feeling like you've never done it before and you have no idea how to do it. And maybe that's because, maybe that's a good thing because it's a new story and it's a new
Yeah.
set of circumstances. But I also think it's something about artists and the artistic process that we're like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, like how could I ever? Well, you
This
just
is
did
this is
several
kind
times.
of leading us into Kay has a question, which is what would be some of your advice slash tips to young writers who are also interested in story writing? And there are so many things I think you can allude to what we've been talking about, you don't always know. Like everything that I have written ever has ended up so different from what I thought it would be when I first started writing it, that it's like you don't know anything when you start writing something. You have all these ideas and you figure it out as you go on. And that would be like if I was to give advice for anybody just as writing, not necessarily getting published, but like write and just let it happen because you're going to figure it out,
Yeah.
but don't don't stick to what your first idea is because it'll grow from there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I totally am with you on letting it happen. I think that's kind of the key, is just like, is as much as I find the process very difficult and emotional and anxiety inducing, I think it's just allowing the process to happen
Mhm.
and accepting whatever comes with it. I think that probably Harvey the play was one of the only things I've ever done where it happened so quickly, the
Hmm.
idea, that it changed in small ways, but it kind of felt fully formed. But I've never had anything else happen that way. All
Right.
of my other plays have evolved, or processes that I've been a part of, processes,
Mhm.
like they've evolved over years and years and years and completely changed. But um, it was a bizarre exception. So I think we just can't know what the process is going to bring. So just like trusting it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, everything is different. Every writing project is different. You know, this thing that I wrote for this year, just to jump in that, I've got this audio drama coming out in November, and if I look back at what I thought it was going to be in in January when I started writing it, like it is nothing. It is nothing like what that initial idea was. And at a certain point, I just had to be like, no, this is the story. I had tried to fit in all these things and I realized that no, this is the story. It's changed completely and I just have to accept that. And that's
Mm,
so hard to do sometimes.
yes. I find it very, very difficult when you can see multiple paths. It's like
Mm,
doing a test that's multiple choice, and you're
mhm.
like, both of these answers, or two of the four, both of these answers apply. They could both be correct. I could see a world in which both could be, both could
Yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
I find that so painful to
Mhm.
pick, like, well, what is the best answer? Or what is the most, the one that applies most to the situation, or whatever. But I feel that way about creative things a lot,
Mhm.
where I could see the options, and I find that so painful.
It is so painful, but like I don't know if you found this like when you were like making all, creating this book and things like that and making the changes that you made. But there comes a point for me where there's sort of an acceptance of no, I was going down this road, but I've been trying to go down that road, but that's not where I'm going anymore. It's changed entirely, and that's no longer the story I'm telling.
Mhm.
And maybe some of those things I can hold on for a future project, and maybe they've influenced where this story is going, but I'm now going down a completely different road, and I have to accept that because to do anything else, it won't be true to the story.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's where I do feel other people really come in to help you. I've
Mhm,
I've had to talk things through a lot with friends, or
mhm.
with Claire, and sort of say, like, I don't know, I could kind of see a world in which we take this wild U-turn. And they've sort of had to be like, I don't think that's it. Or or the opposite, right? Of kind of wanting to cling to something and then
Mhm.
just having to let it go. And I really do value outside eyes and outside ears,
Yeah.
because if I were left to my devices, I don't know what would happen.
I have found the importance of, like, sitting down with my partner and just, like, saying, like, "Listen, this may be rough, but if I'm gonna figure this out, I have to read this out loud to you."
Right.
And just, like, literally out to them, and as I'm reading it, I'm like, "Oh, no, this is not working at all," or, "I think
Mm.
it's working," or whatever. Just, like, having that audience makes me realize what's working and what's not. Just
Yeah.
and sometimes I don't even need the feedback. The feedback can be great is great to have, but sometimes I've already realized the answer in the process of reading and being like, "Nope, nope."
You
The
hit it.
instincts, I was holding on to something that doesn't work anymore.
That's so interesting. That inspires me. I should take a page out of your book, because I recently said to someone that during this process, I did regret that I didn't really have anyone read
Hmm,
it outside of the team that I was working with.
hmm,
My partner read bits and pieces, but I don't know. I was just sort of in a bit of a tunnel when I was writing it, and I don't really know why I didn't. And I think as well, with COVID going on, I didn't really want to burden friends with them as much as they'd be
Sure.
willing, but to be like, hey, would you mind reading this rambling manuscript that needs to be severely edited down? But I really think that that's an important step. I'm definitely, I would do it differently next time. I would say
Well,
that.
that's sort of the as a first book, you get to learn the things that you didn't know and the pitfalls of being a
Mm.
first time author. You have the book there, don't you? You've got it there. Could you hold it up? Because I think it's a great looking cover. I think it's a great looking cover. Because and also having seen the show, I'm like, yeah, that's me. I remember that. So it's like a
Yeah.
really great, it's a great, wonderful cover. Um,
Yes.
Tell me the
Yeah.
story about having this book in your hand for the first time. Tell me about having the physical book.
Yes. So because all of this was happening during COVID, we were doing it all online. So the advance reader copy was a PDF, and or the advanced review copies, the one that go out for reviews and whatnot, was a PDF. So I had that, but I hadn't yet actually held the physical copy. And then
Mm.
very recently, the book comes out on November 2nd. A friend of mine let me know, he works at Indigo. He said, I think the soft covers are here early and they've sort of leaked onto the shelves. And so I heard that. And I really did want to see a physical copy. It was just sort of, because of the fact that we were working in this time, I hadn't
Mm.
yet held a book. And so I went to Indigo and I found the book and I picked it up, and it was amazing to see. I had seen all of
Mm.
or I believe almost all of the illustrations by Anna Braun. And as you said, Phil, I felt that they were so Mimi and so true to the story. And I'm such a big fan of hers,
Yeah.
but it was so neat to see them in hard copy. And I had, waves of excitement and then waves of anxiety because I was just positive that I was going to open it up and I would see like a typo or something. Of course, I didn't. It's wonderful. And my team was amazing. They wouldn't have allowed that to happen.
Mm.
But it's interesting, the anxiety we feel when we're finally able to hold things in our hands. And again, definitely being a debut
Yeah.
novel. It was an
There's
experience.
kind of that it's almost the same as like when you perform a solo show the first time and you're like, am I going to forget everything?
Yes. Yes.
And
100%.
your show, when you performed Harvey and the Extraordinary, it's very intimate because you've got everybody crammed into this garage, and so they're right in front of you, and you're making actual eye contact, which is something that as actors we don't often do, except
Mhm.
when we're performing uh, a solo show like this. I remember the first time I performed my solo show, how I cheated because I was so worried that like looking at people would throw me off. I actually faked it by looking between audience members or
Mm.
looking like beside their ear just to get through it, just to get through it.
Yeah.
But there's sort of like this thing where, you know, the first time something is presented, whether it's a solo play or a book, there's the anxiety of like, am I going to forget everything, or am I going to find a typo? Did they spell my name right, or did I spell, like, what could possibly go wrong? And we sort of like freak ourselves out about these things.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it's nonsensical. It's especially when it comes to publishing because,
Yeah.
like, there's, an incredible number of people who are brilliant at what they do, and
Hmm.
um, that would never happen. I think it's more likely to happen in a solo show,
Yes.
because it's true, like, the feeling of doing when I did my first solo show and doing that first workshop, like, there was no other feeling like that
Hmm.
in theater for me, because you're part of a team, usually you're part of a cast,
Hmm.
you have other people to really rely on. But doing that first one and I believe for my very first one, I never left the stage. And so knowing that you were going to begin the show, you were going to
Hmm.
be there for an hour and you were never going to leave no matter what
Hmm.
happened
Hmm.
was terrifying, like absolutely terrifying. And it just makes you like second guess everything. I think for a while for Harvey, I actually had a script hidden on stage and I never used it and I never would. Like I was always incredibly well prepared, but it's the kind of anxiety that creeps in and makes you
Hmm.
do sort of bizarre things just to cheat yourself into being calm. And so I thought,
Absolutely.
okay, yeah, if I have it somewhere on stage and something happens, I'll literally just walk over and I'll flip to the moment and I'll look at the script. And I never would have needed it. And
No.
I'm sure I never will, but it's the thing that keeps you calm.
You've done your first solo show, and with Harvey and the Extraordinary. So solo performing is something you've done quite a bit. I know how I feel about this. Do you find the process of performing a solo show addictive?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that I do. Um, and I had developed another show
Hmm.
after Harvey, another solo show. And I would say I do because it's all the I do miss a cast, I will say. Just before the pandemic hit, I got to work on a Midsummer Night's Dream with a cast, and it was such a gift. I hadn't been in a cast in so long.
Hmm.
But I do. It feels like the sort of the adrenaline rush that you get when you're
Hmm.
performing with a cast. But there's this kind of additional challenge of knowing that no one's going to save you. That I do think kind of has like an addictive quality. There's something about it. I learned to love the challenge. And I think
Yeah.
during the rehearsals, I get really stressed about it. But once I'm in the performances, I really have fun with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that feeling. But also there's that, to me, it's kind of addictive because it's all you. Like,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
are taking the people on the journey, just yourself. And if you've written it like you have with your shows and I have with mine, there's also that additional, like, these are my words, that I'm doing this. Like, this is all me and I'm doing this. There's this, like, it's not quite a power trip, but it's kind of similar to that, where that's, I think, the addictive quality of, like, I'm doing this. It's just me taking them on this journey. I remember after I finished the first run of my solo show, I was like, I just want to do this all the time.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I hope to feel more like that as I move
Mhm.
forward, but I think the greatest joy I get about the fact that I wrote it is
Mm.
the fact that I am really liberal with lines. I will change my own words all the time,
You
and
have
I
that
enjoy
freedom
it.
as the author. You don't have There's nobody who's gonna be like, "The author didn't write that." You'd be like, "I wrote that. I'll tell you what I wrote in there," you
Yes.
know? And
Yeah,
you get to adjust it on the fly. It's kind of
it's
free.
fun.
I've added whole phrases, sentences, sections on the
Right.
fly to see if they'd work, and then they become part of the show, which is something you could never do if it was written by somebody else.
Yes, and I think it's really true. I love how true it is to the moment and to the people in the
Mhm.
room and to whatever is being kind of put into the space. And when I work in a cast and I work in traditional theater, like I'm very adamant about being word perfect, but
Yeah.
it's just a breath of fresh air. It's really fun. And I think it is very fresh in a way that I think brings the audience in. You're
Mhm.
so aware that they're seeing you and you're seeing them, and there's something about it that's really original.
That's right. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's great. I think you know, there's so many wonderful things about it where you get to have those feelings. And yes, when we work with a cast, we would never throw in words, phrases, extra things, because everybody would just get lost and not know what was happening. But there is that freedom that you can do when you're in a show like this, when you're doing something solo.
Mm.
Um, Now, just as we're drawing to a close, let's remind everybody that the book is out on November 2nd, so they could celebrate Halloween, and then after Halloween, wait Monday, and then on Tuesday, run out to their local bookstore to pick it up, right?
Yes, yes, they can. And I think a lot of people who have pre-ordered have let me know that that it is coming out already, the soft covers. So the hard covers, the official launch is
Mm,
November 2nd. But some of the soft covers have snuck through, and I think people have them early, which is really exciting.
that is exciting. That is
Yeah.
exciting. So that's great.
Yeah.
Eliza, thank you so much for being part of this first Stageworthy live stream, and thanks for having this great conversation with me.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a joy.